Right. Well, the United States and China are uh, the United States and China are the two largest countries in the world. China is the largest manufacturer in the world, and China is also the largest trading country in the world. And so if the United States and China have a good working relationship in which we trade and invest freely with each other, then the world will be a much better place. And I think that we can expect global growth to be stronger than it would be if the United States and China are having trade and investment and technology differences. So it's vital that we reconcile our differences. It is vital that we grow together. We have had 40 years since the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. During that time, there have been no major wars in Asia. The world has benefited greatly from stability and peace, but we should not take that for granted. And we should work hard to ensure that this relationship, which is the foundation for the relationship in the Asia-Pacific region, stays strong and steady into the future. And if not, there will be many unintended consequences that will be not welcomed by both Americans and Chinese. So we have a very important responsibility to address in a forthright manner all of the challenges within the relationship. I think it's a really good question. I think that Ambassador Cui knows very well that there are elements of this relationship where we are competitors. And I think that to be clear about that and to understand that, and indeed to welcome that, is a healthy thing. However, competition can have two meanings. I love to run. I love to run marathons, and I love to compete. And I love it when my fellow runners make me run harder and better and stronger and faster. And I think that that's a healthy form of competition. However, if somebody were to put out their leg and to trip me, or if I were to do the same to somebody else, that is a very unhealthy form of competition. So I think smart, respectful, rules-based competition is a welcome situation, and one that we can embrace. But it must be fair. It must be structured. It must be with commonly accepted rules that are enforceable. And I think that that is certainly within the realm of possibility between the United States and China. Chinese people love to compete as well. I've noticed that Chinese people are very good competitors, even from a very young age. So I think to welcome competition is not a bad thing at all, but we must ensure that that competition is fair, rules-based, transparent, equal, and that both sides, all the players, are given an equal opportunity. And I think that that is what the current trade negotiations are about. We are not asking for anything special, only a level playing field and equal opportunity within the Chinese market. Well, I think that it is very clear that the world needs infrastructure. And many of the countries under which the Belt and Road is being implemented have a very dramatic need for infrastructure investment. So that infrastructure investment, I think, is probably very welcome. And in one sense, it could be considered a common good. However, or a public good, a common public good. However, I think that we must also be clear-eyed and disciplined about the costs of the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is not only a public good. And so let me take 1 minute to reflect on some of the costs. Firstly, the Belt and Road is mostly through debt. Unfortunately, that debt is oftentimes not transparent to the people of that country and or to the world. In other words, deals have been reached for which debt has been given for the provision of services and products to build infrastructure. All of that debt should be transparent to the people of the country and to the World Bank. A second problem is that these projects should be bid in a transparent manner. Currently, most of the projects under the Belt and Road are reserved only for Chinese companies. And I would argue that that is not the best thing for the recipients of those countries. Those countries want employment, they want to provide services, they want to provide labor, they want to provide engineering, they want to provide cement, steel, and other provisions. And currently, so much of that is coming from China, and I think, therefore, the benefit to the recipient economy or country is less than what would be expected under a similar World Bank project or an Asia Development Bank project. Third, I would ask our Chinese friends to be very strict about corruption overseas. My understanding is that till today, there has been no prosecutions for corruption overseas. Now, President Xi Jinping has been very strict about corruption within China, and that's a good thing. I wish that we would see the same type of enthusiasm about corruption outside of China. But to date, there have been, to my knowledge, 0 prosecutions of corrupt officials or companies outside of China associated with the Belt and Road. My fourth note is, please be careful about overburdening Belt and Road countries with debt. Many of the countries that the Belt and Road is active in are highly indebted already. Are they going to be able to pay back these debts? Or are the Chinese people going to be effectively giving this infrastructure to the countries because they are unable to pay for their debt? I hope that the planners and the people responsible for the Belt and Road realize that overburdening a country with debt, especially a less developed country with debt, is not helping them. And indeed, it will not help China's reputation over the longer term if the Chinese people are demanding repayment of debt that is too difficult to repay. So the Belt and Road for 6 years has expanded very, very rapidly. And I think that there are many good projects. However, there are many bad projects too. And I hope that there is due consideration about the bad projects so that you could learn how to make these projects better in the future. And I hope consideration is given to the long-term economic viability of these projects. Chinese companies and the Chinese government learns quickly from mistakes. And I think a number of mistakes have been made with the Belt and Road, and I hope that the lessons are absorbed quickly. When I look at the history of US-China trade, even going back 150 years, what I see is that, for the most part, the development of trade has been dependent on internal domestic changes in China. China is a big country with an enormous market. China is also growing very rapidly. And American-Chinese trade is largely determined by the developments that are internal to China and which are beyond the reach of American companies. So my hope is that we will see continued systematic reform and opening within the Chinese economy that allows foreign companies, and American companies in particular, a level playing field to compete equally with state-owned enterprises and private sector Chinese companies in China. Our perception is that the reform and opening program has slowed, and that as a result of that, that domestic economic growth in China has also slowed. And we believe that it is imperative for sustainable economic growth in China for that reform program to continue. And specifically, I would humbly suggest that the role of state-owned enterprises in China needs to be reviewed. The state-owned enterprises receive a lot of favorable treatment from the Chinese government, from Chinese banks, from provincial and municipal party secretaries, and that benefit to the state-owned enterprises is not helpful from an overall economic growth perspective, and that the role of the state-owned enterprises should be reviewed for the purpose of allowing private Chinese companies and private Chinese individuals greater scope to grow and to prosper. The Chinese state-owned enterprises are growing very rapidly. They are purchasing private Chinese companies. They are joint venturing with private Chinese companies. But your growth, China's growth in the future, will not come from the state-owned enterprises. If you look at employment growth, productivity growth, profit growth, export growth, innovation growth, all of that will come from the private sector. And I am concerned right now that the state-owned sector is crowding out, pushing out private enterprises, and that will slow China's economic growth into the future. So I am very enthusiastic about the prospects for growth in China. I think that in 2018, growth slowed a little bit. That is true. But it's true because of sentiment. It's true because of some changes in tax policy. And it's true also because the government is trying to do the right thing by reducing debt. So for the most part, I think that the growth in 2018 was quite healthy, and it is slower growth but on a bigger base. And so the overall percentage of global growth that China contributed to the whole world is a little bit less than 30%, about 27% perhaps. So that's really good. And I would expect growth to continue in the 6% range in 2019 and to remain well above 5% for the next 7 or 8 years. I think that China can continue to grow robustly into the future, and that growth is a healthier growth than what we saw, and more sustainable than what we saw in the future. And specifically, I think all of us have to be impressed by the growth of consumption by Chinese consumers, particularly middle class consumers in the large cities, but not only the large cities, but the secondary cities and the third tier and fourth tier cities as well. China's growth has been strong in rural areas as well as urban areas, and I think that that's a very, very healthy phenomenon. There is a middle class that has grown in China that is 500 million, 600 million, I'm not sure, but I know it's growing. And I think that we all welcome that warmly. China last year contributed 150 million tourists to the global economy. Wow, that's a big number. And I know that that number will continue to expand, and they are all welcome to enjoy the world, to enjoy all that this beautiful earth that we share has to offer. So I am optimistic about the short and medium prospects of the Chinese economy. I think over the longer term, we must be sober and think about the demographic problems that China has. The fact that the Chinese labor force will be declining in 10 years, and that China will have a very old population in 15 or 20 years, and that will be a burden that will slow growth substantially. But that's 10, 15, 20 years away. And in the meantime, I expect growth to remain robust, and I hope that American companies can fully participate in that economic growth.